Hello chess fans, this is Truxton, and I just played a very interesting game on ICC against a player rated 1880. His name is Alcabezaz, and the reason why I'm making a video on this game is that the game was very interesting. It incorporated a lot of interesting features, including imbalance in the position, where I had bishop plus 2 pawns for his rook, I'm sorry, for my rook, of course. Not only that, my king was in the center of the board for basically the whole game, and the king was useful in the fight. It was defending things, and it was seemed fairly safe over there. Um, and in this game, there was also a pawn promotion, which is really cool. And after the pawn promotion, of course, the rook endgame. Um, so this was cool. It was a French defense, and I'm black, so white played e4, e6 comes, d4, d5. He chose knight c3 here. Normally, what I would do is I'd play knight f6 and pressure e5, and after the pawn goes to e5, I'd just play knight here and c5, maybe f6, and try to bust up his pawn centers. That seems like that's what usually happens, but after watching a video by International Master John Watson, I learned that black can play differently. In this position, if white plays knight d2, black can play knight c6. And what knight c6 does is it pressures the d4 square, and it threatens to take on d4. For example, if white does nothing, if white plays h3, then that would be horrific because pawn takes, knight takes, and I'm winning the d4 pawn for no compensation. So that's the idea that I decided to try, and I don't know if it's really playable after white plays knight c3. I really don't know the specifics with the idea. Or I'm sorry, why black plays it when white plays knight d2, and why doesn't he do it after knight c6? My guess is the reason why black doesn't do it after white plays knight c3 is that after pawn to e5, it's harder for black to play pawn to c5. But I had an idea here, and the idea was bishop b4. Then I'm going to take this knight and double these pawns, and then with my knight on c6, I'm going to hop into a5, which controls c4, and it blockades that the c4 square where his pawns on c2 and c3 might become targets. And also, with his pawn on e5, the center's kind of closed in that position, and maybe I can just castle long, or maybe my king can stay in the center. And so let's see what happens here. So I'm experimenting. Knight c6, and he played e5, and seems like the typical maneuver. The only difference is the knight's blocking the c pawn. So here I played f6 immediately, just trying to undermine his center, and he played f4, strengthening his center, and basically just saying to me that e5 square is secure. And also, what's good about f4 for white is that after knight f3, the pawn isn't blocked, and white can sort of develop casually with knight f3, bishop d3, castle short, and maybe play f5 or even king h1. Just some sort of kingside assault. Of course, though, however, my king isn't going to castle on the king side and sort of allow death to king. I'm going to play a little bolder and maybe keep my king in the center. Okay, so let's see here. I played bishop b4, and he played knight f3, and we see knight e7. And okay, so knight e7 was interesting because I was thinking that he would take on f3, or f6, I mean. Play knight h4 and then queen h5 check, and the only thing about that though is the king goes to d7, and then the d4 square is not secure anymore, and my knight is threatening to take on d4. Maybe the e7 knight can go to f5 and tempo the queen and further attack d4. So what he chose was he took on f6, and then I took back, and then he played bishop e3. And what that does is it says to me that he wants to play knight h4, queen h5 check, and then d4 is secure, or at least it's more secure than it was. But I can handle all that. So first I take the knight, double his pawns, and now what's cool about his bishop e3 from my perspective is that I can play knight f5 immediately and tempo that bishop. And what's cool about this is I didn't see that idea, or this idea, until he played bishop e3. So the idea is not to take the bishop, even if he just defends it. The idea is to go to d6, where the knight exerts influence on e4 and c4. And remember in the other plans, after bishop takes knight, pawn takes, I was playing knight a5 with the idea of just, putting a knight on c4 and hopefully targeting his double pawns. In this, after bishop e3, now I've got two knights there. The knight on f5 can go to d6, where it supports the knight on c4, and maybe I can play pawn to b6 and bishop a6. So that's the plan. Sort of blockade the center, put my king in the center, and I've got the g file if he castles short to have some activity on. White, on the other hand, also has more space, and this pawn on e6 is target. He can put a rook on e1 and double rooks and maybe take that pawn. So it's definitely interesting sort of imbalanced position. Alright, so I played knight f5. He went back. He didn't defend the bishop. I guess he didn't want me to take it. I'm really not sure why, because I don't think I would take that anyway. It seems like his pawns are blocking the d4. Hey, Bobby. I'm not leaving. Oh, you're not leaving. Okay. Alright, so so bishop f2, and I guess he just wants to preserve the bishop pair. So knight d6, our first knight a5, of course, controlling c4, and we see knight h4, his idea. So obviously, I can take that knight, right? But why would I do that? I really don't want to exchange off the knights. His knight on h4 appears silly on the side of the board there. So what I'm going to do is preserve my knight and bring it back to d6 if possible. I've got to calculate things. If he plays queen h4 check, I got to make sure I'm not getting stomped with like a knight g6 check. First, what I was looking at was if I go back. Well, first I looked at the capture, and it's just not good for me. So knight back. He plays queen h4 check. I was looking at king e7, and it's safe, but the king isn't very good on the e file. Like I said, the e6 pawn is weak, and he can put a rook there. So king e6, he doesn't have this check because I'll just take it, and the rook is defended by the queen. But the king is actually better on d7. So I decided that it was safe, and I played knight d6. Okay, knight d6. And he gave this check, queen h5 check, and now the king bravely steps into the center of the board, king d7. Okay. So it looks a little awkward with the king and the queen on the d file where the king blocks the bishop and everything, but it's actually manageable. It's not so easy for white to break up the center with pawn to c4 and a pawn to f5. I was thinking that's what he would do, and I was just going to deal with it. Maybe my king would come over here. I was planning pawn to b6, king c6, king b7, and seems okay. So here he played bishop d3, attacking this h4 pawn, getting the bishop out on a useful diagonal, and maybe planning to castle short. Castling long is possible also. But if you castle long, he has less pawn cover to his king. It's not entirely clear how black is going to play on the queen side unless he brings his knight to c4, and then maybe the queen can come out there. Maybe the rook will stay on a8. I'm not so sure. Um, so here I played b6, and he castled short. Okay, so the kings are defined. My king is in the center. His king is seemingly safe on g1. However, he's got to watch out for the semi-open g file, which I might have operations on. So here I just played king c6, and he played queen e2, and that was a good move. I was expecting queen e2. The thing about it is that I can just play knight c4 though, and he really can't take that knight unless he wants to deal with a knight on c4. Um, he can always come back. He can play knight f3 and knight back to d2, and then he has three attackers on c4. But if he does that, I always have bishop a6, securing that square. And if everything gets exchanged on c4, I end up with a bishop on c4, light squared bishop, and he ends up with a dark squared bishop on f2, where all of his pawns are on dark squares, so his bishop really isn't so hot. It is opposite colored bishops, however, so I'm not so sure. It's probably drawish. But he does have targets. Like, look at the c2 and the a2 pawn. They're on light squares. So, I mean, those are targets for my pieces, for my light squared bishop. So I don't even know if that opposite colored bishop position is a draw. Alright, so let's see what happens. So I played knight c4, and he played rook b8. Alright, so he has some annoying ideas here of pawn to a4 and then pawn to a5, sort of busting up the queen side and trying to attack me on that side of the board. Also, if my bishop goes to a6, then my a7 pawn is blocked. And so the idea for me is to put my pawn on a5 and then the bishop on a6, and the queen side is totally stonewalled. It's like the queen side is blocked off. He doesn't have any pawn moves at all on the queen side, or pawn breaks. So if I secure the queen side, he can't really attack me on that side of the board, and that only leaves the center. But the center is also blocked too, and his break with f5 I think needs to happen. But in order to do that, he has to build it up, and at the same time I could be having operations on the g file. So it seems like an equal game. I'm not sure what's going on at this point. Alright, so I played queen d7, and the reason for that is that, of course, he's planning to play rook e1, right, and pressure this e6 pawn. And I was thinking about defending it with this rook here and the queen here, and giving up this h7 pawn. I was just going to sacrifice that guy for the open h file. He didn't do it though. He let me defend e6 with my other rook. I guess he didn't really care so much about grabbing on h7. Alright, so he played knight back to f3, getting it back into the center. Maybe he wants to play knight d2 and try to get some exchanges on c4. But like I said, I'm not really sure what it does for him. So I played a5, knight d2, bishop a6, and he played now rook fe1. But now I have rook a e8, and in this position, yeah, my king is on c6, and it's a little exposed, but how are you going to get to it? So that's kind of the idea here. And he took the knight, and then in this position, this is a critical position. I have three ways that I can capture that knight. And I can capture that knight with my knight, or I can capture it with my bishop, or I can capture it with my pawn. So first I looked at taking it with the pawn, and unfortunately after pawn takes bishop e4 check, knight takes bishop, queen takes knight check, my king has to go to d7, and I'm not entirely, I don't think that this bishop on a6 is very well placed, stuck behind the c4 pawn. So that's kind of not really in the cards. If I take with the knight, he has the opportunity to take off that knight and play bishop takes knight, and then I no longer have that knight. So I have to ask myself, which minor pieces do I want to play in this endgame? And I decided that if I have this knight for this bishop, then my knight can get to e4, where his light squared bishop can't ever touch it. And I think that that knight on e4 or even c4 dominates that bishop. If the knight's on c4, I can always go back to d6 and then into e4, or maybe even f5. So I think the desirable endgame situation for black is to trade off this knight or I'm sorry, is to keep this knight and play knight versus this dark squared bishop. So the only way that's going to be accomplished is if I trade this bishop for that bishop. The two light squared bishops need to come off, and so bishop takes knight is principle. It's not necessarily true that I can take this bishop, because if I play bishop takes d3, he can always take with the c pawn, and then he has all these breaks with c4. And not only that, my knight can't ever go to e4 or c4 when he has a pawn on d3. So I didn't play bishop takes c4 to take his bishop on d3. I played it to attack the pawn on a2, and also just keep the option open for this exchange. Maybe out of, if I get lucky, he'll take this bishop and allow me to put my knight on e4. So that's the idea. All right. So he played a3, just defending his pawn, and then I played a5, just sort of gaining space. Maybe I'm planning to play h4, h3, and bust up his kingside structure. Actually, playing h3, he can always push past with g3, and it's closed. So, really, the idea of h4 is just to get the is to get the pawn to h4, and not push it to g3 until I've got pieces to sacrifice on the g3 square. Maybe a knight can go to f5 after bishop takes bishop. The knight can go to f5, and after h4, h3, g3, knight takes g3 might work. Okay, so he stopped that idea and played bishop h4, and he's attacking this pawn, and I really don't want to defend it with a rook passively, and I really don't want to push it forward immediately, because if I push it forward immediately, he has this move, bishop f6, which hits the rook, and also plans to come into to e5, which that's an improved position for that bishop. So I didn't allow that, and I played queen f7, which defends this square, and also I'm planning to maybe push this pawn forward and put these pawns on light squares, and this bishop can't go to f6 when my queen's there. So one thing about pawn to f5, though, is that it weakens severely e6. But I always have knight e4 as a reserve, and opposite-colored bishop endgame, and e6 really isn't as weak as it looks. Okay, so the funny thing about this game is that it had a lot to it, and it was really a fast game. It was a 25-minute time control, and that's really, really fast. 15-second increment. So this was a pretty cool game. All right, so let's see here. He played queen f3, and that was sort of an interesting move. It prepares pawn to f5, and it gets on the same diagonal as my king. And so this knight can't move in response to f5 because he'll just take my bishop on c4 for free, and this pawn on d5 isn't really a defender. So here I was another critical moment, and I decided to just stop that idea permanently and just play pawn to f5. And so here he's okay. So since I played pawn to f5, he can pressure this e6 pawn, but like I said, it might be fruitless. So queen g6. Queen g6 was a multi-purpose move. Did a lot of stuff. It got on the g file, threatened things like queen g4. However, I'm not so sure if the queen exchange is really good for black. Defends this pawn from the side. Okay, so he played rook a e1, doubling on the e file, indeed pressuring the e6 square. And so here I'm kind of getting low on time, and I played knight e4. And the main reason why I played knight e4 was because I couldn't really find any other reasonable continuation. maybe possible was rook g8. Okay, so knight e4. That totally gives white the option to take that knight. It seems like, though, if he takes the knight, after I take back, these pawns are still blockaded by the bishop, and there's nothing you can do about that. And this a3 pawn now looks vulnerable. I can play queen g8 or queen g7 and then queen over here and sort of pressure this pawn. You know, get over there. So he did something interesting, and I had to calculate this to make sure it was safe. He played bishop takes bishop. um, okay, so his idea is maybe to sacrifice the exchange for my knight on e4 and try to get some pawns for it and try to create some weaknesses in the black position and infiltrate and maybe try to checkmate the black king. And so pawn takes is forced, and then comes queen e2. So he has multi-purpose ideas here. He has rook takes knight, and after pawn takes pawn check, queen takes queen, rook takes queen, and he's pressuring the e6 pawn. Indirectly, he's also pressuring the c4 pawn. Now directly, he also has. Whoops, I want to go back here. After knight d4 takes queen e2. He's eyeing down this c4 pawn. And I'll tell you what, I do not want to lose that pawn and let his queen check me and sort of like create mayhem on that side of the board. And it's not so easy to just defend it with my pawn. If I play pawn to b5, then he always has pawn to a4, and it's like, I mean, securing that pawn is just not easy. He can take on b5, put a rook on b8. So that was his idea with bishop takes c4, but I think what he might have overlooked was my idea of just king d5. And it's not so easy for white to further attack the c4 pawn. Because I'm controlling b4. He cannot put a rook on b4, and he has no other pieces that can get to c4. But what he can do is he can play rook b1. And what that does is it's multi-purpose. He's threatening to play rook b5, which is strong because then the king has to move, and or seemingly has to move, and then he can take on c4. And I have no pieces that can stop his rook b5 other than my pawn on c6. And so in this position right here, I had to make sure that that rook b1 wasn't a problem. What I decided was, okay, if king d5, rook b1, I'm just going to play pawn to c6 and give up this b6 pawn. That was the idea. Okay, so I was thinking after rook takes b6, I have rook b8, and it's in this position I've got a rook that's going to come down to b1 or b2. After, for example, rook takes rook, I'm threatening rook b2 or rook b1 check, which is really awkward for black, because let's say, for example, white plays just h3. Then I have this check, and his king has to either go to h2 or he has to block with his bishop, and this position it's fairly awkward for white. I can have some operations. I can play rook a1 and attack this a3 pawn. So so this pawn taking it's not so clear. After rook takes b6, I have rook b8, and if he plays rook a6, the same kind of themes happen. Rook b1 check. Now he has to block with his bishop, and now I can play h4. Maybe try to play on the king side. He seems a bit tied up here. However, this pawn, I don't want him to take this pawn, so really, actually, I'm not so sure what to do about that in this position right here. There's got to be something. I think in the game, I was thinking, I can't remember what I was thinking. Maybe I was just thinking of playing rook b5. Then what's his rook doing on a6? The knight can maybe attack that rook. I'm not so sure. This position seems a bit unclear to me. So I'm not so sure what happens in that line. I don't have to move the rook back to b5. I can try, gosh, I mean, this bishop on e1 just isn't moving anywhere. Um, I should be trying to improve my position. However, he is still attacking this c4 pawn. I'm not so sure what to do here. So maybe you guys, listeners, can help me out here. Okay, so he didn't take that b6 pawn. I guess he didn't like those lines. He played queen f3. Okay, but now the c4 pawn isn't under attack anymore. Um, and this knight, it really can't move. I guess the exchange sacks are still on the table. Okay, his idea of queen f3 is strong though, because it immediately addresses this b6 pawn. Because now that his queen's on f3, let's say I do nothing. Let's say I play a4. Now he can play rook takes b6, because after rook b8 he can just take it. Rook takes, and now he has a move. And not only does he have a move, let's say he burns a move. If I ever check on the back rank, now he can block with his rook, and it's much less tied up, and he's okay here. So the threat to the b6 pawn is real now after queen f3. So I just defended it. Rook b8, and he played. I guess he's not so sure what to do here. He just played rook e1, just sort of defending his back rank. And so now I played king d6, and what king d6 does is it threatens a fork. Now my knight can move, and my knight can go to d2, which forks this guy and that guy. And also I'm pressuring the pawn on c3, so it's not easy for him to just like sort of move the queen because of the c3 pawn. So he has to move the rook. He played rook d1, and now here comes a4. So what my idea is to play a4, b5, which totally closes up the queen side to have operations on the king side. Okay, a4, bishop f2. So he's got some really cool ideas here. His idea is like it was before. He wants to put his bishop on e5 and skewer. Well, in this case, skewer my king and my rook. But the only way for him to do that, he'd have to give up 2 pawns, because after pawn to d5, bishop d4, bishop e5 check, he's got to give up 2 pawns, and that's exactly what happened in the game. I allowed it because this knight on e4 is so strong, and I do get 2 pawns and a bishop for a rook. And this knight is so strong, if he ever sacrifices a rook for it, now he'd just be down a material. So here I just allowed it. I played pawn to b5, and here comes d5, sacrificing the first pawn. E takes d5, bishop d4. Now the exchange is happening here because he's attacking this rook, and he's also threatening bishop e5. But that's okay. That's just how I decided to play. So rook e8. Bishop e5 check, rook takes bishop, pawn takes, king takes pawn. So 2 pawns and a rook for, or 2 pawns and a bishop for the rook. And then I still have a strong knight on d5. One thing I'd like to note is that this position is closed. Look at all these pawns still on the board, right? I'm just going to highlight all the pawns. Ignore the arrow. All these pawns. And these pawns are really good for me because his knight or his rooks are kind of like out of the game, and all they have is frontal attacks on the f5 pawn, and which I can easily defend. So because this position is closed, I was thinking that the knight and the 2 pawns has to be favored as opposed to the rook. So let's see what happened. He played g3, and that was a cute move. At first I was like, why would he play g3? Because now I can just play h4 and bust up his position, but that's exactly what he wants. He wants me to play h4 and open the position to get some files for his rooks. Not only does he want me to do that, but he's planning to play queen f4 check, which is deadly because it skewers this rook on b8. So I said no to all that shenanigans and just played queen g4, and he exchanged. And now the position is closed, and the only way for him to open it up is to sacrifice a pawn by playing h4 and then taking en passant. So this position, I think, has got to be better for black. He played king g2, and I just closed the h file, stopped the h4 idea permanently in its tracks, and now how do I win in this position? Obviously, if I could somehow take the c3 and the a3 pawns, then I can get a pawn promotion, right? But it's not so easy how to do that. So here, with little time on the clock, I had to find a plan, and it wasn't so easy. Okay, my plan was, and it's not really a good one, I don't think. The plan is rook h3, knight g5, knight f3, and then take on h2 or tie up his pieces, and play that way. There's got to be a better plan. It's not so clear how I can improve my king, though. So that was the idea. Let's see what happened. All right, so he played rook e3, defending the c3 pawn laterally with his rook. And I just got out of that pin so I could move my knight. And then he pinned the f5 pawn, and I played rook h3 with the idea. So he played rook f4. What else are you going to do? Unpin, and rook back to e1. Okay, so his idea is, he's undefended the c3 pawn. So his idea is if I take on c3, then he has knight check, king up, and then taking on c6. I'm not so sure if that's good for him, but I kind of held him at his word and thought, okay, maybe he's holding there somehow. And I played rook back to h8. Okay, so rook f1, pressuring this pawn. And again, I can take this pawn, but he's taking on f5. And he has this trick here. If I defend it from behind, he has rook takes g4 check, pawn takes rook, and then rook back and taking on f8. And I still think that's better for me because I'm taking on c3, but it does seem to give him some play, so I didn't allow it. And I played rook h5, defending it from the side. And I still have my plan of knight coming in this way. So, okay, rook e4, king over, rook e3, sort of repeating the position, and now I didn't want to repeat the position, so I played knight g5 with my plan. And it allows his rook to come back, but it's not so clear how he's going to stop this devastating threat of knight f3 and then rook takes h2 check. If he pushes h4, then I have taking on en passant, which is really fairly just a trivial calculation. I'll be getting a queen in that line, and he can't take on f3. So he played rook d8, and then I played knight f3 check, or knight f3. I thought he was just going to take the knight and then play down a pawn. I thought that's what his plan was, but it seems like my rook is coming into h2 and attacking c2 and then c3 and then winning. So I think probably black's better here. I haven't put the position on an engine. Maybe we could talk about it. Alright, so he played h4, which is a blunder. Go ahead and pause the video if you want to find the best way to continue. Okay, you've paused the video and you've resumed. Winning here is just pawn takes h3, played in the game, king takes knight, and well, he can't really take the knight because of h2, and then that will be a queen. So really, after taking on passant, he has to do something else. But I think I'm winning if he does anything else too. So h4 was just a bad move for him. So he took the knight, h2, and then rook back to e1, queen, and we get to this rook end game, which is just winning for black. So here I just consolidated the position, attacked that pawn, and then unpinned, and then the a3 pawn's a goner. So took it. He's just, he's just lost here. He's just playing a few more moves. Rook here takes, and now he resigned. Okay, so that was an interesting game. Let's just recap the highlights of it. The king was in the center. There was an imbalance. Knight and 2 pawns for the rook. French defense. So let's recap. Okay. And now the interesting knight c6, which is probably refuted in some line, but I don't know. e5, f6, f4, bishop b4. Takes. Let's double some c-pawns, attack the bishop and get the ideal knights. Avoid the exchange, allow queen h5 check, and bring the king into the center. b6. a5, the idea is bishop a6 after knight d2. And here we're just sort of slowly playing the position. That was a critical moment. Take with the bishop I chose for strategic reasons. Um, A5, poking a little bit on the king side, not allowing queen to f6 after f5. He wants to play f5 himself and sort of have tactics against my king with this pin, with this pawn. Didn't allow it, played f5. And from here, you'll see after knight d5, he chose this way with the idea of an exchange sacrifice or attacking pawns, but it didn't really work out for him after pawn takes, queen e2, king d5. I think rook b1, c6. Maybe he can take on b6, and maybe he should take on b6, because what else are you going to do, right? So maybe here he screwed up, and he should have taken on b6, but he didn't. He played first queen f3 with the idea of when he takes on b6, then he can block any checks that come on the b file. But now I can just defend the pawn, and it seems fairly easy for me to play. Here I chose for the imbalance. I gave the rook for the bishop and 2 pawns, and I think this position is just winning. So I don't know where white really went wrong in this position. I really can't quite figure it out, but that's the point of these videos, is to figure out, you know, what can white do next time. So, and this position just seems to be winning for black, seemingly anyway. Play a few moves, and here he collapsed after h4. This was a great game. I hope you guys learned from it. I sure did, and I'm sure next time he'll probably get me instead of me beating him. All right, see you guys. Bye.